Now, maybe I'll just still start with you, Simon, if you don't mind.
Okay.
This is an interesting report in the sense that it looks back at the history of what happened from sort of the initial day of actually thinking through the research that we need to do, all the way carrying through to policy. What's the reason that enabled you? What are you trying to accomplish with this report?
Well, I think the reason why all these happened is what you're asking.
Yeah. Well, why write a history about it? Building a case study.
Well, I think maybe there are a few reasons. One is as I mentioned earlier, memories will get worse, so it's better to put it down in writing before everything's gone. And secondly, I think this is really a good case study for not just for civic exchange to carry on with the tradition and try to do more of the same, and also for other organizations, all the other institutions who are interested in policy making in Hong Kong to maybe study the whole process and learn a little bit about how we can really influence policy making in a good way, and also there are other overseas examples doing something very similar. That's what I learned in the last few years. And so it's also a case study for comparison.
Great, thank you. And Alexis, I'll come to you for a second as well. Obviously, the title of the publication is From Science to Policy. And what is the involvement of Hong Kong UST from the beginning? How could you take this from science, and what's the impact on the science and the fact-based you develop?
Actually, I want to go even before the science, because actually Simon has gone through a lot, but I think one part I also want to highlight, because we cannot do much without data, because science has to start with something. And I have to say the government, because we do not, a lot of scientists, they go out and really collect their own data, do a lot of in-depth research. Certainly, that's one way of doing things. But in terms of how much you can do by doing things that way is quite limited. The fact that our science can be done actually is built on the data that is collected by EPD, which I would have to say in Hong Kong, particularly the professionalism that was established in the beginning of EPD, getting a lot of data, going out. The science comes from something we call source apportionment. We collect the filter, we analyze, looking at what are the source of the pollution. Those each year, I think EPD right now is spending quite a lot of money every year doing that. Without those data, we can't start, and we really cannot do the analysis. So I think it's very important for us to recognize that, and making sure also the government continuously will keep monitoring all these things, because there are new things coming up, like right now we all worry about other things like VOC or things. The fact that the government take its role in terms of keeping monitoring and make those data available to academic is the starting point of all this. Having the data, then we can say, okay, we notice something like doing what we call the source analysis. Notice in the center of the city, well, ship emission appears to be much more important or significant compared with what at that time everyone was talking about power plant. Actually, CLP and Hong Kong Electric probably was happy, because we were saying that because the emission seems to say they emit most. And then our analysis seems to say, okay, in terms of the center of the city, the ship emission actually contribute 30% of the sulfur dioxide. Their emission only contribute around 7%. But if you look at the emission chart, it's huge part of over 90% is from them. Yeah, so that's because of methodology, because a lot of things. But having that data to be able to say, I think is very important. Okay, so everything really is starting with the data.
Well, that's very interesting. But may I ask, what is distinctive about the science behind this? Because everybody does some research, right? Either Simon or Alexis, you can answer the question. What's distinctive about it? I understand that you went all the way down to the ship level to inventory everything, right? Why is that different from what the government has done?
Well, I guess the difference is we identify something that was not expected at that point. Because the method that we used was not particular. I would say after EPD has collected data for about 4 years, because if you just have a short period of time, you cannot do the analysis. You need to have enough statistical significance. So after collecting those data and doing the analysis and being able to point to something which kind of is quite surprising to them. Actually, one of the first time I meet Peter is that after we published the paper, he come into my office being asked to say, look at this guy's data, see whether there's something wrong with him, find out what's wrong with his thing. He did not say that at that time, but that's what. But I think one other thing is, so we are open, we give them, and they understand that. So the identifying something which kind of is not the, I would say, the common perception is the driver, and then, but the fact that the community respond to it, having Civil Exchange pick it up, because Simon is totally right in the sense that a lot of time we write a paper, we have to move on and write other papers. The fact that Civil Exchange, Arthur and everyone start picking it up and trying to get more information, I think keep the life on this particular topic.
Great. And Peter, I'm going to have to come to you for a minute there. How does Civic Exchange, Hong Kong, UST, etc., how do they help you or not help you in all sorts of different ways in sort of what you're trying to achieve and what you're trying to push in terms of policy?
Well, very useful. The one thing I should say, because a lot of people keep saying that we need clean air, blue sky, this kind of thing. Fundamentally, I don't disagree with that, but the driver is not just blue sky. Driver is public health. So we realized that the fuel being burned at that time with high sulfur fuel like 3.5 weight%, it's not just about sulfur. The metal involved, because they burn the bottom of the barrel type of stuff, is damaging to our lungs and our visibility and our health. So that's part of the driver. So as soon as we learn these things is harmful to us, so we need to do something about it. But if I may, I like to add a slightly different spin on the Alexis and Simon's remarks, is that with my colleagues' help, they did some good work in terms of legislation and listen to Civic Exchange stuff and participating in the engagement process. This is really, really important now. And now, I'd like to share with you one very interesting thing. For government, a lot of time we talk about policy, legislation, control. But Hong Kong being so small, part of the difficulty at that time is that part of the argument was this: well, if we just do it in Hong Kong, do we have the level playing field? As soon as we talk about the level playing field as advocated by Arthur, then some bosses would say that, well, are you crazy? You want the whole of China to change to get that kind of level playing field, with Hong Kong. That's not going to be possible, right? But in reality, I share with you one thing. After the promulgation of the legislation, Fuel at Birth legislation in 2015, July 1st, our bosses in Beijing, they realized there's something in it. And by December 2015, they have new regulation in China, basically copy the big chunk of Hong Kong legislation declaring the free dicker zone in China.
As Simon said, it's very important for the shipping industry that everybody plays on the same pitch. Very important that we all work together. But going back to this, it wasn't just me, all right? A lot of persistence, a lot of luck was involved. But back in 2004, 2005, I think we have to realize it was a very different, people had a very different perception of the environment. We knew that we had air pollution in Hong Kong, but the awareness of the harmful effects of that air pollution were not as great as they were perhaps in 2006, 2007. 2004-05, we knew there was an issue. We couldn't see Kowloon from Hong Kong Island. We knew there was an issue, but we didn't have the data that would help us to understand what was happening with that. It was in 2005, and I've explained this story, I'm sorry if I bore everybody, that I was in the States, I was in Vancouver, and I was talking to the then British Columbia Chamber of Shipping about work going on in Los Angeles, Long Beach for air pollution. Came back here, and Christine Lowe invited me to a dinner with Civic Exchange, this is 2005, early 2005, with Civic Exchange and BPF. And I thought, this is great, I must be important. I've been invited to a dinner by Christine Lowe, sitting on head table next to her, and I thought, wow, gosh, this is really good. And she said towards the end of the dinner, okay, air pollution's a problem in Hong Kong, shipping is a low-hanging fruit. Arthur, why don't you stand up and tell us what you're doing? So I said, okay, 2005, Annex 6 is about to come into force, MARPOL Annex 6. And we will be restricted to burning 4.5% sulfur fuel globally. 45,000 parts per million. Okay, you don't get away with that. All right? So you kind of realize that something's got to happen. The data was coming out. We hadn't quite got to the stage of the reports that Civic Exchange put out saying that the shipping industry was killing 400 people a day. But there's a lot of very alarming stuff coming out. We knew through Anthony Headley at the time that there were a lot of health impacts. What can we do? So from Hong Kong, and it wasn't just me, it was our executive committee at the time that agreed that we should press for a rapid revision of MARPOL Annex 6 with a 1% global cap. And we reckon 1% would be good because we could fulfill it with low sulfur fuel oil as well as distillates. You really could use both. It was a pretty good solution. Every committee meeting we had after that, and I remember very clearly, the chairman used to say to the rest of the committee, do we still support 1% global cap? We were out on a limb, we were out on a branch. Hong Kong was out, just a small local ship owners association was out there with a very ambitious idea as to where we should take Annex 6, which was revised in 2008 with 0.5% global, which comes into effect on the 1st January 2020. We didn't agree with 0.5 because 0.5 is really going quite low for the global, but okay. That's what they agreed. So we came back thinking, well, it's 2020. What do we do in Hong Kong? And so we looked at a lot of different issues. I spent a lot of time in the Civic Exchange office, the old office, not the new one, trying to debate all the different issues, all the different ways that we could perhaps cut air pollution from shipping in Hong Kong. Gave a lot of speeches to a lot of different chambers, and we found that we had the environmentalists, the industry on one side. The government, we couldn't quite convince the government to take us seriously. So we had two sides of the triangle. We couldn't get the third in. Until an AmCham breakfast meeting, which was moderated by, now works for the airport authority, name getting old, Mike Kilburn. And Mike, as we all know, is quite interesting. Is Mike here? No, pity. Interesting character, very, I wouldn't say aggressive, but He knows how to ask questions and make you squirm a bit. And at that breakfast meeting, we had EPD and the Marine Department. Mike, just talking about you. Okay, breakfast meeting with AmCham.
You have to repeat that, what
Yeah,
you said about Mike.
A great moderator. The breakfast meeting with AmCham, you probably remember. We were discussing the various air pollution initiatives for Hong Kong for the shipping industry. You were, as I said, the questions you ask make the people you ask questions squirm in their seats. But we had EPD and the Marine Department at the breakfast meeting. They came to meet with us the next day. Fantastic. We suddenly had three sides of the triangle. And that's when we started having the roundtable meetings arranged by Civic Exchange. Thank you, Civic Exchange. Where we had the different players from the industry. We had the Liner Shipping Association, Marine Department, different people in there. And I think it was the second or the third roundtable meeting when we were discussing the various options. And at that time, the carriers were actually not doing too badly. They felt that they had to perhaps offer something to get a better reputation. The shipping industry doesn't have a great reputation. That we needed to show that we were willing to do something on the carrier's side. And that's when we came up with the idea of the Fair Winds Charter. That was in 2010. And that was really the start. And I was then told by my committee to back off because we weren't the ones from the Shipowner Association that would have to be paying for this. It would be Roberto and his crew that would be paying for it. So we had to kind of withdraw a bit because they had to take it on and run with it. But that was really the backing, and it wasn't just me. It was our entire committee. It was the shipping industry, the members of the association that really pushed us into doing this, but also the willing support of the carriers. We probably couldn't do it today. We probably couldn't have that kind of decision today, because you're absolutely right. By making that voluntary decision, they were spending money with other people coming into the port that were not spending that money. Which is why it was a 2-year Fair Winds Charter, 11-12. We were asked to extend it for 2013, Peter probably remembers, and we said, yes, we'll extend it, but you need to work towards regulation, you've got to work towards persuading the PRD to adopt the same procedures, so we can quite easily put in fuel surcharges. Extended it for 2014. 2015 we got the regulation. Government were incredibly slow in bringing it together. And then we had the level playing field. So those 4 years were very expensive for the carriers that have agreed to carry it through. And we're incredibly grateful to those carriers. Maersk, OOCL, Hamburg Süd, they were all behind it. All the original signees, they kept going with it, they kept going with the reductions, and it's because of that that we got the regulation through. And it was the great support that we got from the industry to make that happen. Why did we get that support? Because we live in Hong Kong. Our children breathe the air in Hong Kong. Because we're here, but also because the industry, as I say, we wanted to be proactive. We wanted to show that we're not bad guys, that we actually do think about the environment that we have to work in and to do something with that environment. There are certain people in the industry that didn't like what we did, but I think that what we did in spurring China, in getting an ambitious result in Annex 6, a little bit too ambitious. We can talk about 2020 later if you like, because it's quite a headache. But certainly, I think if we'd followed through what we proposed from Hong Kong, it would have been a much easier transition to 2020 than we actually have now.
It's a great story to just debunk the myth that the commercial interests are not just self-interested in that sense, but it also aligns with the overall interest of actually wanting regulation because of the level playing field. And doing the right thing.
That's self-interest.
Yeah, that is in fact self-interest, but it's also aligned with the public interest.
And the container carriers, we have to realize, like the cruise ships, they're very close to the customer. They're under pressure from their customers to show environmental improvement. massive pressure. The bulk industry, which I was representing, are not under so much pressure. You're kind of removed from the customer. You're not that close to the customer. But certainly the carriers' customers were putting the carriers under pressure to show environmental credentials. And that certainly helped us at that time.
Great, thank you. Roger, as the former director of Marine, you were front and center of this as well in helping the industry, civic exchange through thinking through regulations, thinking through what is practical. But in your department, the Marine Department, is traditionally sort of focused on safety and maritime safety. Why did you jump on it? What was your role? What were you thinking about at the time?
Well, I think Arthur and Mike and various others, going back to 2006, 2005, 2006, we were concerned, as always, with shipping, with the number of ships that were coming in. They were coming in safely, and as far as pollution was concerned, primarily for ships, we were thinking of oil pollution and, to a certain degree, garbage. Air emissions were just not on the radar. They weren't on the radar from the public. There were very few complaints from people saying this ship's done this or this ship's done that. The occasional one with the Star Ferry, but I mean, very, very few complaints. But the air was so thick, you could put a knife through it. So, I mean, we all live in Hong Kong, as Arthur says, so we all know there's a big problem here. And it was really civic exchange, sort of following on from studies that have been done in the US, that really said, well, we better look into this and get going. How that impacts on government policy, and here's a bit of background on how government makes policy, or doesn't make policy, as some people would say. But, for civil servants, as I am, or I was, back then in 2006, civil servants need a problem to change policy or make new policy. Politicians need a vision. I mean, they come up with visions. That's how they bring policy. And then they tell the civil servants, I've had a vision, and this is what you need to do. Of course, politicians very rarely agree on what that vision should be. But civil servants, we need to have a problem. If you go to your boss and say, we need to change the policy, they say, well, why? And you say, because this problem exists. And in the case of shipping, as far as air emissions went, there really wasn't any identifiable problem to point at. And also in 2006, Hong Kong had stopped developing its port, but all the ports around Hong Kong, in Yantian and all around the PRD, were developing their ports. And so you got the issue of competition. If Hong Kong does something, well, the ships will just divert and go to the other ports, was an easy, simple answer anyway. So I think we all accepted that. So we needed information. And the great thing about the whole process that we've been talking about is the fact the information came from Civic Exchange, it came from an NGO. And at the same time, the people who are going to be affected by it, in other words, the industry that's going to be affected by it, the shipping industry and by extension the shippers, were actually understanding of this problem. They said, yes, we do accept there is a problem here. We're burning very, very heavy fuel, and it is affecting the health, especially of people that live right next to the port at Kwai Chung. And so when armed with all of this, I was able then to go forward to the Secretary for the Environment and say, look, we're willing to go with this. But the caveats that we'd need to look at is that it would have to start off as something where all the shipping companies would comply. That means regulation. And on that, the answer was, well, hold on. You know, Hong Kong's not going to bring a regulation in that's going to benefit Shenzhen. I mean, that will be crazy. Fortunately, Arthur with the industry were able to actually come up and say, well, look, we'll start with a voluntary scheme. If we do that, will you compensate us? Well, if you've ever argued with the Finance Bureau in the Finance Ministry in the Hong Kong government, my answer to Arthur was, well, you get on with the voluntary scheme first. And when you've done that, then we might have a chance of convincing the Financial Secretary to do something in giving some form of compensation. And eventually we might be we'd be able to aim for regulation, which would make everybody comply. And, well, to cut a long story short so you can get questions in, that's effectively what happened. The Fair Winds Charter came in 2010, effective 1st January 2011. With that, we were able to argue with the Financial Secretary. And so you started to get the port and light use reductions in 2012 or maybe announced in 2012. But I mean, you know, it's obviously not going to happen overnight, not in government. But I mean, it happened in the cycle of the budget. And regulation 2015, Arthur says terribly slow. I would say amazingly speedy. Amazingly speedy. I mean, what it is. And the reason being that there was no opposition, because everybody agreed that this was the right thing to do. Politicians had no inclination to have any objections, because everybody agreed. Civil society led in a way. An NGO taking it forward, the industry supporting it, associates supporting it, and that was great. Yeah, perfect example of public-private government partnership. Very rarely see it. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger. And obviously, it's very convenient also in the midst of this, Civic Exchange CEO Christine Low went into the government to make it regulation, which would obviously speed it up. Very, very convenient. So if you want to be a think tank that actually creates a difference, make sure you produce senior civil servants to be, right? So that would be very helpful. I want to open up the floor a little bit. Are there any questions before we move into sort of how do we look ahead in the future? It doesn't have to be questions, it can be comments, because we have actually a lot of people in the room. That's, you know, we have a lot of intelligence, please.
Yeah, thank you. I love the story. So many, still today, a lot of people keep bringing it up and talking about the success. It really is a success story. Of course, it doesn't stop there. There has to be something else, and that's part two. I wanted to ask the question now with Arthur being up front and your involvement in IMO and some of these. We are finding as we move forward, of course, we're addressing sulfur. The 2020 is coming up, and the ECA is coming together. But IMO also has other targets, other initiatives, carbon, NOx. And the impression that, at least from my side that I have, is that these are not very well coordinated. They're kind of, IMO's just doing them kind of on they're not part of a one process. And what impacts one affects the other. Let's say with the sulfur, in order to take out sulfur from the fuel, carbon emissions are emitted. So when the IMO starts talking about carbon, they're going to be pointing to the sulfur guys as the culprit. So how do we move forward to influence more of a unified approach that would be easier to implement? And a second question that you can comment at the same time, maybe, or maybe Simon or some others. How about cross-jurisdictional initiatives. There's many different ways that jurisdictions are looking at improving the air quality. In China, there's the big push for onshore power. And in Hong Kong, that's not a practical solution. But yet the ships that call Hong Kong, also call China, they have to be equipped with the capability to use onshore power. And yet the shipping lines don't work.
Okay, well, I'll try the first part of that, Roberto. You're absolutely right. It is a major problem that we have in the IMO, is really thinking with one brain. We have so many conflicting regulations. We have to do something with one, and then you get another, which seems to go against the one you've just agreed. When you're looking, for example, at the banning of tin anti-fouling, and now we're looking at biofouling on ships has been a major issue. Yes, you're looking at sulfur emissions, you're looking at greenhouse gas issues, and greenhouse gas issues that we're looking at don't help sulfur, and sulfur doesn't help the greenhouse gas. So, yes, you're right. I mean, these things don't seem to be coming through the same UN body. They seem to be coming piecemeal from different places. There is a review at the moment about the IMO decision-making procedure and the way that IMO does make decisions, and I know that Kiteck Lim, the current Secretary General of the IMO, knows that this is a problem. It's the way that one regulation might impact another. But the IMO is a collection of governments, and those governments have very different priorities. Some governments have conflicting priorities. For example, the Marshall Islands. Now, the Marshall Islands is about to disappear underneath the sea because of climate change. They're very worried about it, so they make presentations into the IMO, about having to cut carbon emissions. On the same hand, they're the second or third largest flag. There's an argument at the moment. Either the second or the third largest flag state. So the ship owners under the Marshall Islands, they have different priorities. So it's very difficult to really get the governments in the IMO, which are the same governments that talk within the IPCC, same governments that talk in other UN meetings, but they seem to have different people attending different meetings that come up with different ideas. It is an issue. The industry has been very good at pointing out that there are issues, but then we get accused by Transparency International of controlling the IMO process, which is rubbish. The industry doesn't have a vote. Trying to make sure that what we develop in the IMO is doesn't impact other regulations is actually a major issue that we do try and deal with. But it is a very difficult one because of the conflicting ideas from different governments. Your other point, I think Peter's probably the one to, Peter or Simon are probably the ones to answer that better than I can.
Before I answer any question, you may consider this is a kind of a government propaganda, but then the whole thing about bringing this idea to legislation and bringing the benefit to Hong Kong. In fact, by doing so, Hong Kong in 2015 was the first port in Asia having this control of marine fuel. So intuitively, a lot of people would think that, well, South Korea, Japan, Singapore, something, so they should have done it, but they didn't. So I think we should take stock of this kind of thing, that we are not ashamed of doing it the first things, because by doing so, in fact, there's a lot of pressure. But I think that the team, the group, the partnership overcame this kind of thing and be the first of Asia. But let's see if I catch the question from Roberto. I think the there are a lot of issues involved. For example, the NARCs, another program, the OPS, the onshore power things. Sometimes I feel that there is not enough sensible discussions like what we had before on this kind of issue, because on the one hand, a lot of people feel that, well, if you have this onshore power supply, it's like a magic bullet. Everything will be okay. It's not, because you have to think carefully, like what alluded by Roberto, is that the electricity has to be generated somewhere. And then a lot of people keep saying that all over China, they are doing a lot of this kind of thing. But if you ask the questions about utilization rate, it's much less than 1%. But most authority, I wouldn't say they don't care, but nobody seems to ask the question. They just say, well, if the leaders want me to install this thing, I do it. And the installation cost, the maintenance cost, after a few years, 5 years, they have to replace the whole thing again. So I think, you know, from the government perspective, if we are dealing with the public's money, we have to be very, very careful, because I was told, for example, because we have reserved the land at the Kai Tak terminal already, then they ask, why don't you do something? Well, we made the calculations that the investment would be 500 million to start with. Whether you use it, again, Hong Kong, last year, our calculation is that there are 80 or something ships visiting that part of Hong Kong, using that facility, and there will be 10 ships capable to use the OPS. But if they all use it, we did the calculations that not in 100 years that facility can recover its cost, number one. But if you don't use it, there will be a team of 4 or 5 people to look after the safety things. And it goes on and on. So I think that we have to look at it from the perspective that whether it brings any environmental benefit. If I may add one more point. Recently in China, the local sulfur in fuel is as low as 10 ppm. What does 10 ppm means? In any gasoline station or the diesel you buy from the station, that's 10 ppm, right? So they use it in local ships. For Hong Kong, our current legislation or regulation is 500 ppm. So our counterparts in China is kind of laughing at us that, whoa, you're so slow, you're way behind. But if you look at it globally, no one else is doing it. But then now you have to look at it in such a way that by doing something, what are the benefits you can bring before even doing the cost-benefit analysis. So I think the debate is quite healthy, like the one today. But I think on any major investment or decision on investing in OPS or new legislation on the sulfur regulations, I think taking, for example, the approach Civic Exchange used 10 years ago, I think that's a very, very powerful message that, if stakeholders or the partnership together, we work out a solution, I think it works. And I was told that that's why during the debate in the legislature, no opposition, and some critics within government were saying that of this that would bring the issue of competitiveness of Hong Kong and all this kind of thing. But they were so shocked that industry, everybody were so supportive. I think the engagement and the partnership paved way for this kind of thing is crucial. So So I think that to make use of this kind of example, that for any future investment or major decisions, we should have more of this kind of discussion.